So I decided to title this reflection time Shabby Joy, which is, I think, my own term. I think I just kind of combined some thoughts I had about joy and put them together. But what I like about shabby joy, or the idea of scruffy joy or spontaneous joy, is that it's not the same as the inspirational posters, and it's not the same as the simplicity that we sometimes hear, that we think joy is just all around us and everything is hunky-dory. It's not always that simple, of course. And there's something magical about the unplanned things that happen, that if we're open to it, that those moments give us the joy that we can't even plan for, that is just opening our hearts and our minds to something simpler and something better. And when I was thinking about how joy can just pop up unexpected, I was brought back to a walk I had recently. We have spontaneously acquired a puppy during COVID, as sometimes happens. We did not have it in our plans at all to have a dog. We already have a farm dog, and we did not expect to end up with a Pomeranian. And if you're on a farm, you'll know that having a Pomeranian is actually kind of embarrassing because they're so tiny and fluffy and silly. But this little dog is so much joy in our lives and quite a lot of entertainment, which we didn't expect to have. So sometimes things just happen for a good reason, I guess. So anyway, I'd taken myself out for a walk. It's more about me because I need to walk more than the dog probably does. But I was down the road, and I call everyone a neighbor because our neighborhood is quite huge, but down the road is one of our neighbors, and they're a dear couple who have been living on this farm together for 70 years, and they're in their 90s, and they still live in the farmhouse, and they used to have dogs. Throughout the years, they have over 20 dogs buried in a dog graveyard behind their house. Just a dear, dear couple, and the woman there is becoming very frail, and she just wants to be at home, and she doesn't have a lot of strength, and she was outside when I was walking, and she had her walker, and I was trying to get her attention to say hello so I wouldn't surprise her, and also because I hate to pass by without saying hello. And so she was trying to tidy up her garden, and I tried to get her attention, and finally she saw me, and then quickly she just bypassed the joy of seeing me and went right to the dog, because she saw this little fluff that I was walking with. And I don't know if there's anything that I've seen in the last while that I could compare to the kind of joy she had when she saw that dog. And she just paused, and I was terrified for a moment because she let go of her walker, and she asked if she could touch the dog. And we managed to arrange it that we weren't too close and she could touch the dog. And she sunk her hands into that fluff ball of fur, and she said, "Oh, this is what I needed." And it was just so perfect and beautiful because it just brought her back to that simplicity of this scruffy little dog and this ball of fluff, and the pure love you can have for an animal and the joy that you can feel in these unplanned moments. And it brought her back in time, and it, I hope, brought her to a little moment of happiness that she wasn't expecting in that day. And the bonus was that I was pretty happy as a result too, because there's nothing like bringing somebody a comfort animal when you didn't even know that they needed it. So on my slides, my first one talks about the text from John, and I know there's a lot of words that Dale had to go through to try to get at the joy. The joy is tucked into the middle of all that, and we're not going to unpack all the pieces of the scripture today, because the main focus today is going to be where the scripture says, "Now I'm returning to you. I'm saying these things in the world's hearing so my people can experience my joy complete in them." And the whole gist of it is that we're trying to bring together the connections between Jesus, his understanding of God, and what his followers need to hear. And he had to do this over and over again over his time with his disciples to try to explain what they should take from his teaching. So what's the common connection here? It all goes back every time to love and care and the sense that we're all in this together, this life. And so what's flowing between those connections? Jesus is trying to explain that God has gifted each person in their own way of being, and they all have their uniqueness, and so too we are all connected through this ministry of Jesus, through that story. So during the story, the Spirit is trying to open up the hearts of these listeners as they prepare to take the gift of this story and the gift of themselves into the world in a time that will be without Jesus. So they're allowing themselves to be lit by Jesus, who was lit by his God. So there's this constant relighting of the Spirit and kindling that hope and joy in that story. Now I know that joy is not always simple, And we know that Jesus was not always joyful. Of course he wasn't. He had times of anger and sorrow and frustration just like the rest of us. He was, after all, a human. But he also knew that through it all, that joy had some kind of sustaining power. And despite the spectrum of all the emotions that we have access to as humans, that through it all, experiencing that joy is a true gift. But if we're going to think about joy, we have to also think about the opposite of joy and what would steal our joy. So I've got a slide about stealing. It's amazing what you can find. A sign about stealing joy. So there are lots of ways that we let joy erode from us, or that life happens and it's hard to find that piece of joy that we're looking for. A really simple one is that whole notion of comparison being the thief of joy. That we compare our lives to someone else's. We compare what we've got or what they've got or what we haven't got or haven't done or can't say or don't do. And all those things we think we're supposed to do and be can rob us of that chance to have joy in our lives. Another one is, even though we're in a walk of faith, we feel a failure or a shame if we don't think we're doing it right, or we think our life doesn't seem to be on course and we're making mistakes, and we let it get us down. Another one that I think is quite common is waiting for perfection, or that extra over-functioning, that busy, thinking that if we just do enough and check off enough boxes and do all the things in the right way, that then we're going to find the joy. We're just going to keep getting to it later. And sometimes later it doesn't come. And I'm really interested in this topic because of how it relates. There's like the spiritual side of it, but also the psychology side of it. And so there's a slide here about all the feelings. And it's all the little faces of how we might feel and what that might look like. And this goes back to, this happens now in education when we're working with young folks, trying to talk to them about how do we name what we're feeling. And it came up this year because Mental Health Week in Canada used Name It, Don't Numb It as their theme for Mental Health Week, which was just recently. And it's such an interesting concept because sometimes we need to take time to understand what it is we're feeling and find a name for it so we can figure out how to sit with it and what to do with it and how to process it. And ultimately, if it's a hard feeling, how to move on from it and find something else, because all the feelings, they aren't permanent, but it's good to know what they are when we're feeling them. And this is not just an exercise for children, it's for all of us children to figure out these feelings. So why do we not want to numb them? Well, psychology and spirituality tell us that if we think of ourselves as a vessel, as some kind of a container, if we keep those difficult feelings on the inside, those things that we don't express start to eat away at us, and they'll hurt us from the inside out. And that can be expressed in a lot of ways, in mental illness, in anger, in actual physical sickness that can come out of not dealing with the hard things and not naming those hard feelings. And in today's world, what would numbing look like? I'm sure we can think of a few. I've already named the over-functioning, that capitalist mindset or that Protestant work ethic where we just think do all the things until we get happy. Or we think that constant access to television or social media or the news, we kind of numb ourselves with just overflow of information. And you can also think about the ways we self-medicate with alcohol, with drugs, and sometimes those things can feel like a bit of help in a hard time, but sometimes they take over and they start to control us, and that can become a danger. And all those numbing activities help us to bury those feelings so deep that we think they're never going to come back. But I know, and I think maybe you know too, that sometimes those things eventually do bubble up again, eventually, even if we've numbed them for a little while. And I know in the faith world, I know sometimes we feel weak or not faithful enough because maybe we've heard a message that if we live a certain way, or if we pray a certain way, or pray even harder, that we're going to fix the sadness that we feel, or we're going to fix the anger. And if we're not feeling that fix, then we're not faithful enough. And I think that can lead people to a lot of sadness and hiding and shame when they feel like they're separate from the faith they'd like to enjoy with their Creator. But I wonder what it would take if we took some time to sit for a minute with some of those hard feelings and give them a name, have some help to process them maybe, give them a timeline or a deadline, and then find some room for the other feelings that might get us back toward joy. So the next slide is one of those not so great feelings. And I'm sure if you've survived the past year or so as I have, worry has been a component because we have lots of things to worry about, and we worry about our own situation during a pandemic or in everyday life. We worry about loved ones that we can't help and want to support. We worry about choices that we're making or that we failed to make. And of course, sometimes the weight of the world becomes those worries that just stack up and weigh us down. They become so great. And part of this story is here that it is normal to be worried, and Jesus would have worried too. He had worries about his disciples. He had worries about injustice. He worried about what was coming next in the risks he was taking to try to spread a message and teach others about this great love that we could access. So worry is definitely one of those feelings we sit with. And the next one is sadness. And I think we've all had times of darkness and sadness, some of us more than others. And this can come in the form of a situation or real grief that's happening because of a change or missing a loved one or a big change in our life that's going to be affecting and giving us a big feeling of loss. But it can also come from nothing, because some of us have a chemistry or a mental health situation that makes the darkness much more prevalent, and it makes it hard to escape into some form of lightness. So when we have to deal with loss and grief, the sadness is there. And we also know that Jesus had those times too. He would have experienced loss sort of in advance, knowing that he was going to eventually have his story go on without him, and others had to carry on, and he had to leave his friends and have them go without him. And he would have been sad when he knew to prepare himself for betrayal of his friends, and knowing that the leaders were ultimately going to make him the sacrifice to prove that they were still going to be in charge of the empire, and they didn't want his story of love and justice to win. There was certainly sadness then. And how about the anger? You can put whatever name you want on that picture. It's anger, it's rage, it's mad, it's frustrated. But we've had those times when someone does us wrong and when life is unfair, and life has lots of times when it's unfair and it's random and it's not things we've caused, but we still get mad. And we know that Jesus also got mad, and of course the best example of that is when he got mad enough to flip a table in the temple, because he saw that people were being treated unfairly by the leaders of the church, and they were being forced to give up money they didn't have in order to worship. And he wanted safety and justice for folks that couldn't speak for themselves, and so he found ways to use his anger for good. So all these hard feelings and heavy feelings, they're not ones we need to feel shame for feeling, because they are real and they're available to us, and they're a normal reaction to what's happening in our minds, with our chemistry, with life as we know it. It's all part of the human experience, and shame does not need to be part of that picture. So when we think about how to sit with the difficult emotions, I have a slide here that speaks to the psychology, but I'm also going to pair it with a little bit of a check-in with the Psalms, which of course is the spiritual side of things. So this little feed is one that I follow. It's called Bless the Messy, and it's just full of quirky little notes and ideas about how to deal with the things that life brings us and what the feelings are. And so what can we do when we're having difficult emotions? Definitely, we've already talked about naming it. This little graphic talks about breathing and accepting. And I think in our spiritual life, you can liken that to times of meditation or contemplation, or singing through it, praying through it, being out in nature with it, getting out of your head. And it's also a reminder to yourself that feelings are temporary, that they can be replaced. So there's a feeling now, and something else can move in and replace that feeling when we've had our time with it. There's also a good idea to check in with yourself and say, what's the root of this? Is it rooted in fact? Is it rooted in something, an old story? Is it rooted in something I tell myself or something that someone else tells me? And the most important part is to find a way to acknowledge it, but also let it go. Let that emotion be a visitor if it's a hard one, and let it go, and don't hold on to it forever. You'll never escape the sad and the mad and the angry, but those emotions don't need to be with us all of the time. We can make room for peace and joy in among it. But when I was able to take some time to study the Psalms in my study years, I found it really interesting how the poet had written all these songs, these psalms, as a way of expressing the whole range of human emotions. So there were times that psalms were there to let us find the words to cry out in pain to God, times to cry out in lament and sadness, but also ways to express joy and praise. They're all in the book, and Jesus knew about those words from his tradition too. So there's basically a psalm for all these feelings we're talking about naming. So when we're in that deep sadness, Psalm 6:3 says, "My soul is in deep anguish. How long, Lord, how long?" And we do have these moments during pandemic days especially, not knowing how long we have for this to be over, not knowing how long we have until something good can happen or till we can see the ones we love. And there's one on sadness, of course. There's many, but I've just picked a few to highlight. So Psalm 30, verse 4, simply says, "Weeping may last, but with the morning comes joy." And that speaks to the notion of the cycle that, yes, we can name the sadness is here, but new mornings will come, new sunrises will come, and with that can come a new start and some new hope for another day, and room for a new feeling. And of course, there's plenty of songs that we sing in church life that are written about the joy that is first expressed in the Psalms. And one is Psalm 5:11, which reads, "Let all you who take refuge in you be glad. Let them ever sing for joy. Spread your protection over them. Those who love your name will rejoice in you." So there's lots of ways to notice that the Bible allows these expressions too. So those are all available to us, and they were written for us. And there's even a neat word that I've been reintroduced to through an article that I think there are plenty of psalms for this one as well. And the term is languishing. So the New York Times ran a story recently, and it was written by someone more on the psychological side, but she wrote about how it is for our minds and our spirits and our souls when we're in this time of waiting. We've already given up a whole bunch of energy to tackle the pandemic head on and try to follow the rules, try to understand what's happening and what's changing. But what happened this spring was a whole bunch of us kind of hit a wall. And we thought, oh, spring's coming, we're going to be happy, it's going to be joyful, it's a new season. But it didn't really end up feeling that great because we're not there yet. And it's that feeling of blah and yuck and why aren't we done yet? And she labeled that as languishing, which is a word we don't get to use anymore. But for me and the folks that I shared it with, it resonated so deeply to hear a word and to have it affirm that this is all of us. You know, it's normal to not feel great, even when it's spring, because we're still waiting for better answers and better answers and better days to come ahead. So in that waiting and in the uncertainty and in the frustrations, we have ancient words, and we can reinvent words and reuse the words with poetry and ritual and articles to lean on. And it helps me to know that the feelings are as old as the human story. So in all of that, we're not alone. And I hope we can get some reassurance to know that the poet who wrote these psalms and wrote them down knew that our Maker could handle all of our big feelings, even the yucky ones, even the messy ones, and that Jesus knew that all of this was available to us, this love that could encompass our lives and our feelings and our imperfections too. And something that I think helps us to deal with getting back to joy is finding something a bit up close and noticing something that's nearby, so that we're not taking on the worries of the world at all times. And this next slide shows this scrappy little bird that I found, and I just find him very entertaining. So he says, "I used to think I lived in an ugly place, and I'd have to go far away to find some beauty. But I've learned it's not about looking further, but closer." And this little squawky bird looks up closer, and there's just a slide now of just his eyeball. And he's just so close to that one little plant. And I think there's something good for our souls when we can kind of hone in right on that, something good that's so close to home, and just rediscover the joy that's around us. Finding that joy can sometimes be an inside or a nearby job. So the next slide shows something that I notice a lot of us doing these days, and that's getting right up close to nature and finding ways to notice a little bit of joy. Not perfect joy, but just this scrappy joy. I mean, this is my garden, and it's not weeded, and there's some branches in the way, but I find that flower, and I take a picture, and it helps me remember that they're still good, even in the not-so-great days. So it's those celebrations of snow melt and blooms coming and yards greening and sunrise and sunset. all those little moments in time that are sparking a feeling of joy. And the next one is a little turtle that my nephew shared over Zoom with me. He's been out exploring, and he found a painted turtle. And this little guy, he said, "Aunt Janine, it's just as big as a quarter. It just fits right in your hand." And there's something pretty joyful about that human encounter with something of creation that makes us remember that there's still some joy in the world. So whether we have those birds and critters on our hikes, or chance meetups on the sidewalk, or surprise phone call moments, all of those things make us seen and loved. And the next photo is about scruffy hospitality. And that's a notion that I've read about for a while, and I love the idea because it's based on spontaneous. It's based on not being ready, not being perfect, and just being able to be with people as we are, imperfectly perfect. And so I think this is a way to imagine how we can get ourselves back when we get out of these COVID days, is finding ways to not wait for everything to line up and be aligned, but just letting go of some of those perfection tendencies so we can let go of and let the joy to enter in. And the next slide is about shabby chic, which of course is part of my title today with Shabby Joy. And it's that trend of restoring furniture that's old, but not so restored that it looks perfect again. It's embracing the imperfections and celebrating the history, but also enjoying the fact that it's still got some beauty in it. And I think these pieces are a bit like us, with a bit of history and a story, and some inherent goodness that doesn't need to be proven. And maybe a bit like us, our Creator can see us and experience us as good enough and worthy and loved, with our bumps and bruises and our mistakes and all. Jesus knew that our Creator loved us like children and is there to reassure us and shelter us, even when we're broken or used up and scrabbling around for a little bit of joy. So the next slide just speaks of that time of peace. And I like this time because I want to focus on things that people have told me you find that give you peace, and it's looking outside or seeing your yard or having that time of a hot drink or a book and some peace. Getting away from comparison and getting away from perfection. And also knowing that sometimes good enough is just that, it's good enough. Giving ourselves and others grace to be the perfectly imperfect people that we were made to be. And I noticed that when Jesus needed time for his own peace, he also found ways to get a break from his teaching and his leading. He also took solace in the Maker's world, with time to reflect and pray in the desert and in the garden, connecting with nature and being alone. So when I think about all the feelings we've been gifted with, we notice about the difficult feelings, and we think sometimes by noticing those and feeling those things, we're getting it wrong. And we beat ourselves up, and we can't get ourselves lifted up. But sometimes it needs to come back to the impression that we're only getting life right if we're getting everything perfectly right, and that's something we need to challenge in our own minds. And so I hope we can find our way back to a simple and maybe even shabby or scruffy notion of joy. Of course, feeling the sad, noticing the angry and the lament, but also taking time for joy and permission to simply be. Able to be good enough, and accepting that a task getting done well is better than one that is postponed forever until we think it's perfectly done. To be a good enough coworker, a good enough friend, or a partner, or a good enough parent. And I hope that sometimes this quest for imperfection instead of perfection will leave us that breathing room we need for joy. And so the next slide is just that scruffy moment of joy that we can find on the sidewalk, when we can find those simple moments that are imperfect and close to home and close to heart, remembering and looking forward to breaking bread together and sharing time with all kinds of humans, as Jesus did. And I wonder what Jesus would do with us in the here and now. I like to think he would he would be with us as we experience the sorrow that we need to, without the guilt. And he would encourage us to rage when we need to solve the hurts in our lives and the hurts in our world. But that he would especially enjoy us finding joy. And so I wonder if we are able to find the imperfect and the scruffy and the shabby moments that persist in bringing us joy, even when the noise of the world would have us skip all the joy and dwell instead on the worry and the fear and the anger. So whether you're planning that first imperfect, messy, post-COVID potluck, or the chaos of a group hug, or soaking in the sunset, overlooking your incomplete house tidying. Maybe just remember that simple childlike wonder of holding onto the soft fur of a comforting pet who loves you, just as your perfectly imperfect self, just good enough self, above all. So may we all feel the joy and feel grateful at the end of the day. Amen.